Welcome everybody. It's a pleasure today to introduce Jennifer Kellogg and her recently published book, Book of Exercises #2 by George Seferis. I'm going to say a few things about the poet first, George Seferis, and then a few words about our translator, and then we're gonna read some poems. I'm not going to, Jennifer will, and have a discussion about them and the context that they were written. So Greece has had the fortune of having George Seferis as one of its national poets, so to speak. He was the first Nobel laureate. He was born in 1900 and passed in 1971 during the Junta. He spent most of his career as a diplomat, navigating a succession of crises, starting with the Metaxas dictatorship, then moving on with the exile, the government in exile during World War II in Cairo, the German occupation, of course, and then the Greek Civil War that started during the occupation and ensued afterwards. And then the ongoing Cyprus crisis that began in the 50s and then reached its apogee in the 70s. His death under the junta became a moment of national mourning and resistance. Throughout these decades, he officially represented the Greek Prime Minister and King, serving across Europe and Africa while watching his country endure horrific losses from afar. Jennifer describes this tension in his poetry, but also in his life, I guess, also in his prose writing, between duty and despair, that left a deep mark on his writing, as he suggests in the book. Now, Jennifer Kellogg will read, as I said, some selections of Seferis' tragic and satiric poetry from this period of political turmoil, or geopolitical turmoil, we should say. Her translation of Book of Exercises 2 presents previously untranslated work that reveals the anguish and absurdity of the poet's personal and political life. Now, Jennifer is a literary translator from modern Greek. She holds a PhD in modern languages and literatures from the University of Brussels, or the Free University, I guess. I will butcher the French, but you can say it.
ULB.
Okay, well, that's easy for me too. ULB. In 2019, she was an emerging translator mentee of the American Literary Translators Association, and her translations have appeared in the Common, Agni, the Kenyon Review, among other publications. This is her first book-length translation, and it received the Constantinidis Translation Prize from the Modern Greek Studies Association, and was longlisted for the Pan-American Poetry in Translation Prize. So, without further ado, welcome to the Institute for European Russian Eurasian Studies.
Thank you, Harry.
And the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for having me and for inviting me. I'd like to jump right in with some poems in honor of today being Greek Easter, or Orthodox Easter Monday. So I'm going to read two poems from the time of the Greek Civil War that reference Easter. And I'll start with the first one and read it. It's a short poem in Greek. Απρίλης. Κι ας ήρθε ο Απρίλης με τα βάγια και τις πασχαλιές. Πια δεν ακούω τίποτε. Θαρείς και χιόνισε όλη νύχτα. 5 Απριλίου 1946. April. Even though April has arrived with palms and lilacs, I still don't hear anything. You would think it had snowed all night. April 5th, 1946. And the next poem is called Postscript to Gymnopedia, January 1945. The sea that took you far away, soft as a mother's breast, it knows. The things you questioned as a child are now the mumblings of old men, fantasies of useless objects, the sealed trunk of drowned sailors. Look, they fear the light of the sun. They're afraid to see. They babble. They have nothing else. Some children grow up hungry, uprooting trees, devastating mountains. Others ask questions and get answers. Why did they get one step ahead? Up or down? I don't know. It makes no difference. Still, they have many fires to light for the feast of St. John. Once upon a time, I said blood brings blood and more blood. They took it as the performance of a buffoon, useless fairy tales. Still, I would whisper, stones are heavy, and the millstones are unliftable. You heard them grinding to a halt one night on the edge of time, and then tragically, young bodies drowned. Worn out rags, said the sorcerers. But how will we dress in the cold when we have nothing new? And what will you say to your friends when they are sorrowful and fall silent, and the passionate songs delight only whores? Still, this too I said, you should perceive life's moments. You should discern the wind shaking the roses from the roses, in a tiny garden no larger than a handful of earth. This I tried to do, I would say, not as the mind's recollection, but as a matter of breathing, for me, for you, or better yet, as a kind of voicing. The wind is a passing voice. The sea took you far away and brought you back to the familiar port, granting you the silence beyond the docks, the boundless midday silence. The sea knows how to teach you the mysteries of Good Friday and Easter. And I just want to read one short poem from 1954, which helps to set the stage for Seferis' life. This is untitled. I wandered, got tired, wrote very little, but returning home was always on my mind, 40 years. Man is an infant at all ages, in the cradle's tenderness and brutality. Like the shoreline and the sea, everything else is erased, our embrace and the sound of our voice. So I want to begin by just talking a little bit about how I came to translate this book. As you can probably tell from my name, I am a non-native Greek speaker. I have no Greek heritage, and I came to Greece in the 90s for my junior year abroad in Athens. I already had studied classical Greek and could read Greek at that time. And in my first year Greek history class, I learned about what we call in Greece the Asia Minor catastrophe, which was an exchange of peoples from the countries of Greece and Turkey in 1922 after the Greco-Turkish War of 1921 and 1922. And this created a massive refugee crisis, mostly in Greece, but to some extent in Turkey as well. And I became utterly obsessed with this historical event. And this was in the 90s, it was about 70 years after the event. And I tried to understand how we could see the traces of this great migration of peoples in modern Greece. And as someone whose family had come from Eastern Europe, from Russia, in the early 1900s, I felt that that part of my own story was lost in the mists of time. And so the Asia Minor catastrophe was something that I could somehow try to understand and grasp about what this might feel like for people. And I turned to literature to help me understand the emotional effects of the Asia Minor catastrophe. And that's when I discovered Seferis, because Seferis was born in 1900 in Smyrna, now Izmir in Turkey. His father was a diplomat for the Greek state, and he left Turkey in 1914 when World War I broke out, and he always assumed, he and his whole family assumed that they would return, which didn't happen, and his own family home was destroyed in Izmir in 1922. And so, because Seferis is such a major poet in Greece and in the Greek canon, and his identity as a refugee was not always emphasized, but I thought that somehow you could find these traces of this lost homeland in his poetry that drew me into his poetry. And even before I was fluent in Greek, I began reading Seferis, writing, dialoguing with him, kind of beginning my lifelong fascination with him. Now, I don't believe that poetry is historical fact. I don't feel that we can read the historical events in the poetry, but again, more what it did to the poet personally and how he represents the collective imagination or the collective experience. And I also think that every time we read a poem, we approach it with wherever we are in our own personal experience in that given moment. And so for that reason, poetry is always, kind of infinitely changing. Our interpretation, our reading of it, our experience of it is always different. And that belief supported me as I began to move deeper into reading a poet who has such a huge stature in Greece. I don't know if you would agree with me on that, Ari, but
Yeah.
he's kind of like a major national figure, especially after he won the Nobel in 1963. And that prize, meant that he was representing the Greek people on such an even larger scale than he did when he was a diplomat. So Seferis is a modernist poet. We can compare him to someone like T.S. Eliot or Pound, maybe Wallace Stevens or other Anglo-modernist writers. He was good friends with Lawrence Durrell, Henry Miller, and he met T.S. Eliot a few times in his life, which was a major touchstone for him. And when he was young, he was very inspired by Eliot's Wasteland, and Seferis' most well-known poem is called Mythhistorima, which we also translated in English as Mythhistorima, which means myth history. And that's a 24-poem cycle, which his critics had called a backwards odyssey. And it's the companions, it's a story of people who may resemble the companions of Odysseus in the Odyssey, kind of trapped in a Greek island location, trying to return home after some sort of disaster or war. His poetry was marked by the fact that when he was writing, the Greek language was mostly written in a purified or formal Greek called katharevousa, and Seferis, he had to work in that language in his everyday job, but he was a big proponent for the Greek of the spoken people and what we call demonic Greek. And so he's a major modernist figure for the way that he wrote in Greek, the themes that he touched upon, and how all of his poetry is about a homeland. And for me, it's all about a lost homeland.
And just to add, because you turned to me earlier, and I was
Yes.
thinking, I wanted to say something. Many in the room may know his poetry through the songs that Mikis Theodorakis, especially Strophi, the 1931 poems, Άρνηση and some others, famous quotes like «Πήραμε τη ζωή μας λάθος και αλλάξαμε ζωή». How would you translate this? I was about to do it, but we have the expert here, so yeah.
We made a mistake in the way that we grasped our lives.
And we changed lives.
We changed our
also,
lives.
right? So it's a doubling down on that and kind of like, so what is the change here? Is it a good change or a bad change? We can discuss that. But a lot of these, what I wanted to say is that a lot of these lines are in the subconscious of a lot of Greeks, without even knowing that this is written by Seferis. Because they heard the song because it's played on the radio. And whatever, they know it's a Theodorakis maybe song, but they don't necessarily know that this is a Seferis line or poem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I just wanted to add that there are multiple ways that culture trickles down, so to speak, or gets popularized. And that fits with what you were saying about writing in a particular type of language, but being a proponent of the demotic, but also caring about his poems. And I guess all poets want their poems to be read, by a lot of people. What a better way than getting, into a song by one of the best composers in the world and disseminating through that.
Yeah, it is a kind of immortality for his
Totally.
poetry.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sorry, I
No, no.
derailed your
No.
comments, but I think that was important for some of the audience. I don't know, I don't want to ask and embarrass people and say, how many of you knew that this song was by, the lyrics were by, Seferis? I don't think many Greeks would actually, definitely not contemporary Greeks.
Yeah.
Maybe in the 70s they knew that. Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
She knew.
Yeah. Yeah, I said I don't want to put people on the spot. To be honest. Yeah, Alex, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So by the time I finally decided to write a dissertation on Seferis in the 2000s, he had been kind of thoroughly studied.
Mm-hmm.
You might say even debunked in a way, in terms of his view on Greece, on nationalism. A lot of scholars in the 90s and 2000s who were influenced by post-structuralism and kind of deconstructing nationalist poetics really focused on Seferis. And I would say they tried to, kind of almost like take the wind out of his sails or demonstrate how a lot of his poetry was in service to a nationalist agenda. But for me, that left me the freedom to go back into his poetry and to look at it a different way and consider how I might translate it. Also, his translators have mostly been men. I'm the only woman to publish a book-length translation in English of Seferis. And as I'll share, this book was completely forgotten. So Seferis' poems, beginning in the 50s and 60s, were collected into one collected volume. The way he wrote his poetry, and as you'll see as I read more poems, is that he wrote them in a kind of diaristic way with the date or the place because he traveled all the time. And so for him, poetry was a record, kind of what was going on in his life and his movement and his thoughts. And he would come back to Greece from posts abroad. He would collect whatever poems he had written and then self-publish them up until basically the 60s. And so these poems all got put together in something called the collected works, first in Greek and then in English. And because he was a diplomat, he was very fortunate to have translators and friends who were all part of the Anglo-American literary community who recognized his talent, were part of a group of writers, mostly expats, people like, again, Lawrence Durrell and others. And so they were able to introduce him both to English-speaking translators, but then also to the people who would he might need to connect with in order to become more well-known and be nominated for something like the Nobel Prize.
Mm-hmm.
So, but he has been translated continuously, but again by white men, basically. And so that I always felt that was an opportunity for me, and I worked behind the scenes for several decades, to be honest, on perfecting my Seferis voice and learning how to inhabit this voice and offer my own translation. And because I don't have to prove his literary greatness with my translations, I can be more free to just express myself and express what this poetry does for me, both in English and in Greek. So do you have anything you might want to add before I turn to talking about this book?
I think you should make the first set of comments so we can open up. And I have many questions that I don't want to take. I have many questions about your relations with Seferis that I want to keep for later. Are you going to read more
I
poems?
will. Yes, I am.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so.
And these are not. I wanted to emphasize. Maybe you said it already and I forget, but these are not mainstream poems that every Greek would have read in high school, let's say, right? Jennifer translated some of the poems that are not as much translated at all in the US, right? Or in English, sorry. But also, they're not the most famous poems necessarily, or the ones that became songs, right? So that makes this a special collection, in my view, that we can dig into the historicity of why are these poems not as popular, maybe, and these are the type of questions I want us to explore later. Yeah.
Yep. So this Book of Exercises 2, was following that same pattern that Seferis retired as ambassador to the United Kingdom in 1962, and he had gathered a bunch of poems, some of which he had kept on the side because of their political nature, and others that he was still writing and creating. And he was in the process of putting this manuscript together, and his publisher had even announced it was coming out when he was nominated for the Nobel. And because the material in this book is more political, satiric, some erotic poetry, it was immediately set to the side. And Seferis thought he was going to finish it, but after the Nobel Prize, he became ill, and the dictatorship, the Junta dictatorship, came in, and he never finished the manuscript. But he was always going to complete it. There is a Book of Exercises 1, which was published in 1940, just before he left Greece with the Greek government in exile. And so this, because it contains a lot of the work that he wrote while he was in Egypt with the Greek government in exile during the German occupation of Greece, that's one reason why it's called Book of Exercises 2. However, this book was ignored by his translators because it was perceived to be like extras, remainders, things that were published posthumously, because it was published in 1976 and the poet died in 1971. And so that's why it kind of always got set to the side, and I'm going to say honestly forgotten. There's very few scholars that have looked into this book, even though it contains a lot of evidence for what were his personal experiences, what were things that he might want to express but couldn't, and kind of first-hand accounts of some of the events and things he lived through. So this, my process in translating this book was to follow what Seferis' editor compiled and put together in 1976. So the layout of the book, everything that you read in it, is consistent with the 1976 edition. So I want to turn to some of these poems now from the 1930s and 40s. And I'll begin by reading two poems that are about a monumental bronze statue of the Romanian king, Carol I. And this is kind of like an equine statue. If we think of some of the Confederate statues or the statues around DC of generals on horses, this is what this was like. And these two poems were written in 1939 when Seferis was representing Greece in the Balkan Pact. And this was a pact after, we say a mutual non-aggression pact, after World War I among Balkan countries. And this pact was about to be violated as the Italians invaded Albania and the war was getting closer to Greece. So, the first poem is called The Danubian Principality's Horse, a caprice by Matthew Pascalis. A slope, a spear, a tree. On the other side, a horse. In the space between flow bodies, women's fragrances, men neither joyful nor glum, decided rather than decisive, Perhaps the others decide for them, the two kings, the one inhabiting a bronze form and the other who inhabits a flesh form. Perhaps the two kings decide, or the horse. His chasm of a belly is so lightly elevated on four legs. The sound of his feet clip-clopping on the pavement excites us. The horror is never revealed. We never see the great fishhook catching us from the rusted red pier. When you notice terror's presence, you also catch sight of death. A hook-shaped sperm bursts forth from his petrifying testicles and resounds deeply, like an indifferent cannon at a stately home in Idra. This seed of death never fails to embed itself in those who are marked. They are dragged, like Achilles did Hector, on his back, in the dust, pale, naked, humiliated, past embroidered and flickering neon signs, past women's exhausted breasts, love's stagnant ditches, through burning tires and automobile exhaust, through oppressive heat and military regiments presenting their weapons, while bugles hover. Surely the dead are returned to the belly of the horse, even while the dead king also rides on the horse's back, a monstrous lump. And the horse's nostrils flare in revulsion. A ritual unfolds, soundless and unknown, an offering to the man who held the globe and scepter, an offering to the horse within the man. The horse whinnies and bloodies his hooves, unsatisfied even now that the rider has alchemized sleep. A ritual unfolds, devoid of priestly movements, no torches, no official rites, rather a ritual done in our pedestrian ways, with our micro-afflictions and impersonal joys, our brow furrowed as usual when we answer the ringing phone, with our tired eyes and handshake jerky when we meet someone. A sick procession held in the temporary staged world order. And then this poem has a companion poem, which is kind of an absurd farce. And this poem was written for another diplomat that Seferis was at these negotiations with, Takis Papatsonis, who was also a poet and diplomat. And they had a joke that this statue reminded them of the horse in the Jean Cocteau movie Orphée, where this horse is a prophetic horse who spells out the word shit with his paw. And so that's why this poem is called The Horse Didn't Say Shit. Like, this horse was not prophetic. The horse didn't say S-H-I-T. It's a shit show, Taki Papazzoni. Screw it. The horse had changed. Devastating. Absolutely devastating, as the blind poet would say. He knew of mice and men and the everyday risks of life. You might think you heard the horse speaking in Gaulish about Madame Eurydice or General Cambronne, as if he were a Transylvanian colonel with shiny brass buttons, gold braiding around his shoulders, and a Greek name, above all else, a weed from the mud of Byzantium. But he didn't speak. He fooled you. Zilch, an accursed silence. What a crafty bastard, scion of the usurper. He's just an old drunk satyr, leaving the Bodega Dragomir tavern with his intestines rumbling full of gas, while muttering St. Paul's 5 pleas to the Galatians. And that was written in Bucharest, May 1939. So, I think this is the poem that might have shocked the translation committee of the Modern Greek Studies Association. They read it at the award ceremony. I don't think anyone ever expected those sentiments from Seferis, or just something quite so bawdy. But there's a lot of poems like this, to be honest, in this volume that are send-ups of politicians, of situations that, try to express the absurdity and the humor as a way of coping with basically the impossible situation that Seferis found himself in. I'd like to read one or two more.
Unless there's a question in the last one. No? Okay.
Okay. So, so Seferis was very influenced by English idioms, by rhyme schemes, limericks, and he wrote nursery rhymes. He wrote a number of poems that are kind of like nursery rhymes that are collected in this volume. And those are a way for him to say, this is absolutely absurd, and to kind of retell his version of some of these events with a satiric voice. So I'm going to read this poem. It's called Partisans in the Middle East. And this is about an event when the British brought all of the heads of different factions of Greek partisans who were battling the Germans in Greece to Egypt to try to work out their differences and become a more cohesive front against the Germans. Partisans in the Middle East, a recounting for the guys. Things were quiet, let's say, here where fate decreed we stay, in the heat festering like yeast within the Middle East. When the river began to swell, our minds expanded as well, like the rushes and ranks, thick on the riverbank. It was then that the partisans landed with pistols and maps, no more business as usual. Demas was with Rukos, Katarius with Pyrrho, and the boss with Tiro. To remind them of Greece, they were put on fresh peaks, where spies lurked in deceit. What have they got going on? What have they got going on? They said in the colonial haunts. Who are they trying to wile? Who are they trying to wile? They said, dining on the Nile. We wonder to whose avail would it be to send these mails to take the wind from our sails? Maybe it was the Allies, but it's us they prize and enmity they abhor among the peoples at war, to rescue humanity from the evil of slavery. Maybe it was the Arabs, though, wanting to make a little dough? But friend, what about the mainland Greeks? They do acclaim with joy each crisis and pain. They must have found a cause to interrupt our restful pause. Whenever they would pry, he was slow to reply. Sallow, with a cold eye, he'd ask, "What kind of nonsense is this? I've lost the thread. You're talking horse sense. Why don't you put it on a shelf? It'd be much better for your health. Idle talk is a poison to the self. Instead, it would be proper to inquire of your neighbor and your local butcher, and the Arab in his stall, offering warm peanuts to all. It'd be a lot easier to swallow." When the partisans laid eyes on their nation's prized figurehead, they realized the severity of their plight. They negotiated day and night. They battled day and night to solve the crisis in our land that had become a total sham. Instead, the Brits who fed this beast but paid not a red cent for its upkeep decided to call Trump on their friends. Without giving an explanation as solemn as a funeral oration, they gathered up the partisans, and off they went again to the high mountains. And that's in honor of the partisans named the Doves, written September 5th and through October 24th, 1943.
Wow. Yeah. I've noticed in some of them you're keeping the rhyme.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't always have rhyme himself, but in this one you really kept the rhyme. How do you decide when to do that?
Well, for this poem, everything rhymed, and it was part of the intent to make it
satirical to an extent.
Yeah.
Or critical, I guess. I don't know.
Critical, yeah. There were other times that the rhymes scheme was so short and so difficult, and it could not be translated into English and make sense, that I let it go in favor of the meaning.
And here, some of these poems are deeply political, and without context, you can't really understand who is the Kytrinos, Anthropos, and who is, what's going on. It requires quite a bit of digging, because he's living these things, and it's almost like his own notes in a meeting that he's bored,
Yeah.
so to speak.
Yeah, totally.
Other people draw, he was writing poems, I don't know.
He was
just
trying
rhymed.
too. Yeah.
Yeah.
So do we have a few
Yeah, we have
minutes, or
time. Yeah, we do have time.
Okay.
Yeah.
So since you mentioned drawing, I'll just point out that in the back of the book, there are his calligraphies, which he made while he was in Egypt with the government in exile. And these are poems that are also pictures. So you can see this picture, or this begins on page 194. And these are based on something that the French poet Apollinaire had done during World War I. He called his calligrams. And so these are all kind of quite sad and bitter poems about being in Egypt during the time of a lot of death and destruction in Greece. So maybe I'll read one of these.
Uplifting.
Yeah. So this is untitled. If you touch the lyre, your fingers bleed. God doesn't want it. Better to sleep in its shade. Perhaps a stray dream will arrive, taking pity on you. Use care, however, when setting up your traps for the winged ones. If they should ascend, don't wake up. Remember, they are your thoughts, soaring like flying fish. I'll just read one more. This one is also entitled, What did you lose, sad woman? Your eyes rain tears and drown like a water lily in the rain. Perhaps you are longing for the sea, or maybe you, poor woman, are the serenity of the sea. So I want to close and then go to questions with one poem, one final poem.
When did he stop writing? What's the last?
So his last poems are collected in this volume. I believe his last poem was 1971, and that was a poem that was critical of the Junta colonels. And that poem was secretly published, and it was published just before his death, and that's one reason why his death was such a major event. Yes. So this book also contains a few drafts for Mythistorima, which was that 24-poem backward odyssey that I mentioned earlier. And this poem I'm going to read, the final chorus, is basically a summary of Seferis' whole approach in Mythistorima and what he's trying to do with the finished poem. It's called the final chorus. An altered folktale, that's what we're paying off. All the others too, like our elders who held canes and spoke serenely and were reduced to ashes. The murky bath, the net, the knife, the deep-hued purple, and the voice that questioned the sea. Who could drain it? These symbols nourished our life. We imbibed our love drop by drop. It seemed a poison pill to build our immunity, until the end came and our love was eradicated. Truly, our people always guided us with prudence. Enough of life, this life, encircled by Mount Spendeli and Hymettus and Parnitha. But the roots don't wither easily. They don't easily disappear, the defilements of madness, of injustice, of vain pursuits. We're paying off an altered folktale on these very same rocks for 3,000 years and more. Pity those who are yet to come. November 26, 1934. Thank you.
Deep. Yeah.
Did they meet in Cairo and Alexandria with the partisans? Was a big Greek community in Alexandria?
Yes, yes, they met in Cairo, I believe. Yes.
Do you have any contact with Gaddafi?
I believe that Gaddafi was already deceased.
I thought he died in the 30s.
Yes, so he would have come to Cairo after Gaddafi was
Yeah,
deceased.
he didn't.
But he was he didn't know how he felt about Gaddafi. He was very distressed by Gaddafi and Gaddafi's poetry. And at the time that he was in Egypt, he wrote many essays about Gaddafi that he never published. He was trying to work out what Gaddafi meant for himself and understand Gaddafi while he was in Cairo. Good question. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for doing this. I grew up reading Greek poetry at school, and so it always makes me really emotional to see a collection of poems that sometimes are less accessible to us. I had a comment, but also maybe a point for conversation for you. I think Seferis, and actually Gaddafi, because I'm a personal fan of Gaddafi, I think the poems they wrote, because they're sometimes political, but a lot of the times like self-reflective and very relatable to some of the emotions that maybe we can't put into words ourselves. After all these years, I still at times find those, even though we're in a different political era, I still find the frustrations and the concerns very relatable, and I wonder about your creative process. You spoke a little bit about how important it was for you to bring your own interpretation and your own self-expression. Did you use some of the frustrations of the politics of our time to relate, or do you distinct yourself from that and try to immerse yourself in what it was for them back then? I think that's very interesting to me.
This is Alexia. Maybe introduce yourselves before you
Hi,
ask.
I'm so
we
sorry.
did the round earlier. But
I'm
yeah.
so sorry. My name's Alexia. I'm a master's student here in GW. I'm doing security policy, and I was
And reading poetry.
Yeah, born and raised in Greece, but I also had a degree in dance, so anything that has to do with poetry or the arts is very interesting to me.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you were here at the beginning when I talked about how I got into Seferis because I was obsessed with the Asia Minor catastrophe.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, even though that disaster had happened 70 years before I found out about it, it felt so real, and it felt so, like something that could happen in any moment again. And I'm very passionate still about the refugee crisis in Greece. Mm-hmm. And refugees are a big issue for my heart. So for my writing and scholarly process, I did try to understand the context, look at the language, and how you might translate some of those words that Seferis used in the language of the time. Like, for example, there's a poem where he talks about African art galleries, and he says in Greek, Negro art galleries, and I left that word in. But for me personally, I feel that everything he went through is entirely contemporary, and it's contemporary not just because of what's happening today, but because it's in our genetic memory, it's in our collective memory, and I think that we are all kind of living out the fears and the experiences of our ancestors, even in a new context, day after day. So I think it's very important to bring back the voice of Seferis and look at how he coped with these stresses and anxieties and what was his perspective. And we can, again, I talked in the beginning about how he was kind of debunked, and we can say, oh, he was, an educated white man, representing the Greek state, but he felt extremely powerless despite his privilege. And so that is something that we all are confronting right now, regardless of who we are.
Both Gaddafi and Seferis were using the past to speak about the present.
Yes.
But they did it quite differently. Do you want to? I mean, you don't have to elaborate on Cavafis, but Cavafis was using, for example, just a superficial thing. He was using Hellenistic times more.
Yes.
Well,
yeah.
Seferis was using more like the Odyssey and like more mythological almost periods of Greek past. So, I mean, that's an obvious kind of comparison. But then, do you see other ways they're different in their use of the historical past? I haven't thought about it, but because of both of your questions, I've been thinking of how else, and other similarities. They both use the Katharevousa in terms of form, but they both write basically in Demotic Greek.
Yeah.
So they both kind of modernize the language, but also use the tropes of Katharevousa. But maybe maybe Seferis a little bit less. But I'm just trying to think of, and plus, as you said, Seferis was 33 when Cavafis died.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously he was old enough to know and appreciate Cavafis, but they hadn't met physically, I think, right?
Yeah, and I think that there is also I think one of the reasons there was a fascination for Seferis with Cavafis was they were both part of this diaspora, which shrunk, and they were part of the Greeks living in places that were not Greece, and those places had their own cultures. And I think that's one thing that Seferis probably admired in Cavafis, is how he was speaking from his time and place and trying to put that into his poetry. But yes, Seferis uses myth in a very particular way. I mean, having translated this book, now when I look back at some of the poems, like Thrush, which uses the figure of Elpenor in the Odyssey, Seferis is talking about the futility of. He's using myth to point out the futility of people in Greece, their lives and how their lives felt like they were not very productive, or they weren't going anywhere, or they were trapped in these situations.
But if you think, just to be provocative here,
yeah.
At the same time, you can see that as futility. Futility could also be liberating in one way. If you think about it from the perspective of today's world and the anxieties that people have, especially with social media and everything.
Yeah.
I remember going back to my visits to Mount Athos. Someone can go there and say, oh my God, this is futile. Every day you wake up at 4 a.m, you go and do the same thing, then you go and toil the land, then you eat with the same people, and then again and again. You could see it like that, and then you can see that's, kind of very liberating, because in a way you say, well, my death doesn't matter. This is going to continue after, it has been happening since 300, Common Era, and then we'll go ironic to talk about Mount Athos and Common Era in one sentence, but still, let's say AD, right? So at the same time, this is kind of like the power of the Greek civilization, if you want, or what he's describing is that in this futility, maybe it's the meaning at the same time. Or the liberation from trying to find meaning, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah, and
yeah.
What did you say, Glenn?
I said, okay, Zorba.
Yeah, exactly. No, but I'm saying like that's a different interpretation of the. Is it a critique or is it actually an apotheosis of this? I don't know.
No, and I mean that's something.
I don't know.
It's a good point, and in this volume there are a number of short poems about the futility and about just dying without, just dying, just having a death that no one acknowledges. You just pass out of this world, rather than how strenuous he worked in his life to find meaning in the Greek tradition, and he felt himself to be a champion for a particular version of Greek culture, and he honored that in his Nobel speech, honoring Demotic Greek, honoring poets like Calvos and Solomos, and putting himself in that vein. So yeah, maybe some poems about fertility were very psychologically supportive.
Yeah, because I'm just thinking out loud, in the sense, in different points in time, humans find different ways to cope with their finite kind of existence. That may be a way to interpret some of what's happening here in different periods and different moments. Any? You have a question? No. Sophia.
Just nothing that deep, but I was just wondering, what's the original title of this collection?
Τετράδιο γυμνασμάτων 2.
Okay, because I was trying to figure it out.
What was the original title again?
Τετράδιο γυμνασμάτων 2.
Is that literal? I mean, is that
It's literal.
literal book of
Yes.
exercise book or?
Yes.
May I have to ask the question not of Jenny but of these two young women? Were you taught in what context were you taught his poetry in school? What I don't know. I'm just curious. Not having heard of him and embarrassed that in my education this escaped me, but to understand how you, besides songs, how you would have been taught, in what context, how many poems, part of the national curricula. I just don't know.
I was thinking we probably have the same kind of, because it's a national curriculum. So for us it was like we had modern Greek, and there was a distinction of more of a language course, and there was like a literature course where there was a lot of poetry, and all the big Greek poets, so like Eurypis and Cavafis and Seferis, whatever. We had to read these poems and analyze. So I think, do you remember specifically?
Right now I can't think. For us, we did a lot of Cavafy. I think he was more of those poets that you would hear about. Seferis, I'm sure we've encountered, but all of our exams around the literature course was being able to analyze and interpret a lot of that. I do remember using the historical context a lot. That mattered at that time. But yeah, I definitely appreciate it more now than I did.
Thank you. No, thanks. I was just curious about where. And Jenny, do you know? I mean, I guess you said I asked who would be. Is there course adoption for this book? And I know maybe you could say you just went to at least whatever you were doing in Rochester, but I'm curious about when someone like Seferis would be included in, say, American or British curricula in IB, AP. It seems so, just from what I'm learning today, as someone who taught those kinds of curricula, it just makes me say how much you could teach by taking one of these poems and giving the context, and it's amazing.
Totally, yeah.
Well, believe it or not, I did read Seferis in high school in English.
You did?
Yeah. I was a creative writing and poetry major in my high school, and I had a set of teachers who introduced world literature, and we read the Keeley and Sherrard, the main translators, version of both Seferis and Elitis, who won the Nobel Prize in the 70s as well. But when I was deciding what to do with this manuscript, I had permission to translate it. I had to decide, was it going to be a scholarly edition, who was I going to pitch the book to, or was I going to make it more of a creative edition? And I made it a creative edition with, kind of my own translations standing on their own.
Just to translate this for the uninitiated, it means, should I have more footnotes than there are poems? Or that's kind of a way to put it.
Yeah, yes. There were going to be more footnotes than there were poems, for sure. Or am I going to try to make this a literary work that stands on its own? And that was my choice. And so, I would love to see this included in modern Greek studies literature curricula as a new way of looking at Seferis. That would be a dream come true for me. Right now, I was speaking to the Masters in Literary Translation program at the University of Rochester, and the undergraduates and graduates grilled me on all of my translation choices, which is very fun.
I see also that there are notes that you created, I guess, that these are not, but these, in a sense, these are the footnotes,
yes,
which are such a great way to do it, I think, to make for a popular edition.
Yeah.
That was the compromise.
Yes.
That was a compromise.
Between the
Between the
full
footnotes
and the full way of going.
Oh, the full way.
And the what what Jennifer decided to do, which
Yeah.
is a more creative, but with some of this academic, how should you call it? I guess academic
Yeah.
approach to this.
References.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, can you
Because-
talk a little bit about how you so because they're not long, but they're,
Yeah,
how,
tell
how
us
you
maybe how you
decided
decided how long they
which
should be.
ones to do and how much to say.
Well,
That's a good point.
I just want to say that I know these poems demand a lot from the readers, and that was part of my choice. Was that you would pick it up, you might not understand it, but you would come back to it over and over again, and let Seferis' voice start to sink in deeper. For the notes, I wanted to really give the bare bones so that you could understand the poem. And then nowadays you can go to Wikipedia, you can look up the thing really quick, and get more information if you're really interested in the parade of King George II in 1935 or something like that. So that was why I made that choice. Yeah.
Sorry, I had another question, and I'm sorry if I'm making you repeat something you said at the beginning. I wonder whether other efforts of people to translate Seferis' work were distractive for you, or did they complement the effort that you were doing? And then can you talk about some of the biggest challenges, maybe because you obviously have a great knowledge of the language and of literature in that way, but were there moments where, particularly in this work, were challenging to you?
Yeah, so can you say the first part of your question again?
Yeah, whether other efforts to
Other
translate, whether,
translators.
yeah.
Yeah, I guess it's just my personality that as soon as I felt confident in the Greek, I stopped reading the English. And there were times when I needed to build confidence in myself, when I would go back and read the Keeley and Sherrard translations and see that I felt my own language was a little bit more alive, a little bit more resonant. And it's nothing against their translations. They were writing for their time and place, writing for their audience of mostly erudite literary readers in the 50s and 60s. But yeah, I really stuck to myself for the most part, and my own interpretation and my own creative process. And then the thing that was the most difficult was a lot of the formal poems were poems that were imitating other Greek writers. Like there's Solomos, there's Calvos, there's forms that were very intricate that he was satirizing. That was like, okay, how am I'm imitating Seferis, imitating someone else, and then staying true to the way his voice sounds for me and how I render it in English. And so a lot of the rhyming poems, I went back to many drafts. And also I had the pressure just saying that this book has the Greek on the facing page. And for a Greek reader, I
prefer that too.
yeah, you're
It's
gonna
really important.
you're gonna look, and even as we were laying out the book, I'd be like, oh, that there's one word that belongs,
Doesn't break
Yeah,
the right
n-
things.
yeah, in the Greek, and so we were really fine tuning. But also that's something that I'm really proud of. And for those of you who have had a classical education, when we're translating Greek, we're always translating it, line by line, word by word, making sure everything is.
But you skip sometimes, like you reverse when I saw in one of the poems you just read today, you brought one sentence earlier because you thought it fit better.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
I
was
don't
just-
want to sacrifice.
That's what I was doing on the computer. I was looking at the Greek because and I was like, oh, I see this is reversed now. But
Mhm.
it's because that was her voice.
Yeah, exactly.
Or her
His
interpretation of Seferis' voice, maybe.
Yeah.
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 Or her rendering of it. Yeah.
Maybe there's a merging of our voices now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Mhm.
Is Carol the first, was he in the 30s?
Yes.
And he had a mistress named Lepescu,
Maybe.
Jewish mistress.
Yeah.
Yes, I thought that was his time. He was very controversial.
Yes.
And
Yes.
very, I think, kind of maybe allied with him.
think he was, yeah.
He was very to the right,
Mhm.
the bad boy.
Mhm.
When you were doing the translation and steeped in some of his world, I guess, or having read other things or not read other things, did you dream as him or of him?
No, but I did listen. So the Harvard Poetry Library, in the 60s, he went to Harvard and he recorded himself reading his own poetry before he died. And I listened to that over and over again. And I highly recommend, there's a podcast that LIFO magazine did of him, of excerpts from his diaries. And they use those recordings, the Harvard Library recordings, and you can just pull it up on your phone. It's wonderful.
Just hadn't thought how much what you do in translation is, in a way, like an actor inhabiting. When you said that you were trying to get get his voice, or your voice of his voice, and still be yourself, and still convey his words, and just hadn't thought about it in that.
Yeah, and that's why for me I can only translate what I really love. I don't work as a professional translator, and I'm not. I mean, I could translate Greek anything if I wanted to, but it won't have that same color to it. I really have to inhabit it in order to do it.
You have another question?
Yeah, I'm sorry, one more.
Your body language is.
I'm sorry. I'm sure there's a lot of poems that you probably really like. Have you encountered in Seferis pieces that probably, I don't know, weren't satisfying to you or weren't fulfilling for you? And what's your approach there? Do you include them either way because you think they're important, or I don't know? I'm curious to ask.
Yeah, I mean, there was a process of, like, I translated all of the good ones first,
Yeah.
I'd say. Then I left the hard ones to the side, and then
It's kind of with homework.
Yeah.
You like, and then you leave that.
Yeah. But then eventually, even the poems that were kind of boring or a little flat, I really wanted to see them as part of the whole book, and like bring them out of my own frustration and into what is the whole book, how does it all fit together, kind of reestablish their place among the collection. Yeah.
Maybe we can end with one more poem.
Sure. Do
You
you
choose.
Do you have a?
Maybe you choose, Alexia. You you earned your choice. Or Sophia, whoever goes first.
I really like the O Τελευταίος Χορός, the final chorus.
Yeah.
But we read that one.
Oh, you read?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No problem.
It is good. It's a
It's a
good
good
one.
one. That's why I was.
That's
Maybe on the Asplathus.
Yeah.
She was exactly on that page here.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. I was like,
I'm not-
this
I'm
is
not joking.
the one we need to do.
I saw Spring
It's Palafon.
Returned, and it's available.
That's a good one to end on.
This was the last poem he ever published. I can't say whether it was the last poem he ever wrote, but okay. On the Aspalathus. Spring returned, and on that day of the Annunciation, ancient Sunion was beautiful. A few green leaves around rust-colored stones, the red earth, and gorse bushes displaying their huge thorns at the ready, with yellow flowers too. In the distance stood the ancient columns, while strains of plunder still echoed in the air. Serenity. What could have reminded me of that Ardeaeus? I believe it was only one word in Plato's Republic, lost in the recesses of my mind. The name for that yellow bush hasn't changed since then. That evening I found the passage. They bound him hand and foot, it tells us. They cast him down and flayed him, dragged him aside and tore him to shreds, on the thorny Aspalathus. Then they hurled him into Tartarus, tattered. That's how he paid for his crimes in the underworld. Ardeaeus of Pamphylia, the most wretched tyrant. March 31st, 1971.
a telling date and a telling poem. Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, join me in thanking Jennifer
Thank
for
you.
sharing.
Thank you.